Okay, hello, Assalamualaikum. So in this video, we will learn about the development of the skeletal and muscular system. So first, we're going to focus on the skeletal system. Alright, so for the skeletal system, we're going to look at how the skull is developed, and the skull will include, if you remember from our lecture, the neurocranium that houses the brain, okay, the cavalia, and you also have the viscerocranium, which is basically the bony structure of the face, the skeleton of the face. And then we're going to look at how the axial skeleton will be developed. And with axial skeleton, mostly we're going to talk about the thoracic cage. So that includes the vertebra, the ribs, as well as the sternum, okay, and then lastly we'll be looking at the limbs, okay, so the upper limb, lower limb, and how we get to go from just having a limb bud to forming our long upper limbs and long lower limbs. All right, before we go on any further, we're just going to go back to embryology, okay, to learn about the neurocranium, the development of neurocranium and the development of the viscerocranium and the skull in general. This always has to be revised again. Okay, so remember you have the bilamina disc. Okay, so you have a bilamina disc of your embryo. Okay, so the outermost, okay, in blue here, this is the ectoderm. Okay, so trilamina. Okay, so it's gonna be three layers. Okay, three layers. So you have the ectoderm that is on the outermost, and then you have in the middle you have what is known as the mesoderm. Okay, and then in green, the innermost layer would be the endoderm. Okay, and what are the other structures that we see in the midline here? So these are coming from your ectoderm as well, like the neural tube here. So it's during gastrulation, the part of the ectoderm will invaginate inwards. Okay, all invaginate inwards and form this neural tube, and then you also have on the sides here, this is your neural crest cells. Okay, neural crest cells. So this all will originate from the ectoderm, and then in black there, that's your notochord. Okay, so these are the structures that you should be quite familiar with, okay, whenever we're talking embryology. Other important bits is that if you can see the structures in red, okay, you can see that it's going to have a few different parts to the structure. So let's just name them. Right, so right around the notochord, okay, just lateral to the notochord, you have part of the mesoderm, and this is called your paraaxial mesoderm. Okay, so your paraaxial mesoderm is lateral to your notochord, and then next to the paraaxial mesoderm, lateral to that, this is called the intermediate mesoderm. Okay, so all of these are mesoderms anyway, so yeah, intermediate mesoderms. And lastly, at the sides here, these bits here, this is called your lateral plate mesoderm. Okay, so lateral plate mesoderm, you can see that this whole thing here is lateral plate, but it's going to divide into two. Okay, so you have the splagnic layer and the somatic layer. So somatic and splagnic layer. When we look into a much more complete embryo, when I will draw a sagittal a cross section, you can see clearly the somatic and splagnic. But I think for now, it's good that you remember back that these structures here. Okay, and then if you were to take, okay, I'm not supposed to do that. So if you were to take the notochord or the neural tube here, right? We want to take the neural tube. Instead of doing a cross section to the embryo, I'm going to bring it out and I'm going to put it longitudinally. Okay, so I'm going to put it longitudinally, and this is your neural tube here. So at the sides of the neural tube, you can see these are your neural crest cells. So I put the neural crest cells at the sides here. Okay, at the sides of the neural crest cell, you can see the paraxial mesoderm. So I put the paraxial mesoderm there. Okay, and this paraxial mesoderm will go through what is known as segmentation process. Okay, so once it goes through this segmentation process, right, so the paraxial, okay, it goes through segmentation, and once it goes into segmentation, it will produce what is known as somites. Okay, so you have quite a lot of somites throughout the length of the neural tube, throughout the length of the embryo, and they would also grow in like a cranial to caudal fashion. So the top parts here will grow first, and then it will move inferiorly or caudally. Okay, and at the top bits here, okay, near where the proximal or the cranial part of the neural tube is, these are called your occipital somites. Right, so somites, you're gonna eventually produce like close to 50. Some books say about 45, 44, 45. Some books say close to 50 throughout the up till week 5 of the embryo's life. Okay, and these somites are all going to we're going to see how it's going to take part in the musculoskeletal system. Right, so what these structures do is that, okay, so the structures, the occipital somites that's near to the cranial part of the neural tube, okay, they're going to migrate upwards. Both the paraxial somites, the occipital somites, as well as the neural crest cell, they're going to go upwards here, okay, and they're going to surround the developing neural tube. Okay, and eventually they're going to form the neurocranium. All right, so that is how it happens in embryos. Okay, so we're just going to go see the structures. Okay, so neurocranium, you know, the housing of the skull. Okay, if you remember neurocranium, you can actually have the top part, okay, which is sort of like the skull cap, okay, and then the base of the skull itself. So the base of the skull. So in this picture here, we're looking at the base, and this picture here, we're looking at the top part. Okay, so if you were to read certain books, they have actually different names. Okay, so for the base here, it's called chondrocranium. Okay, later we'll see why it's called chondrocranium. And the top part of the skull cap, this is called the membranous neurocranium. Okay, so one is called membranous neurocranium, one is called chondrocranium, or chondroneurocranium. Some books also say that. So why is it called differently? Okay, so first we're going to look at the chondrocranium. So chondrocranium is going to be made up of many different bones, okay, as we all know, as we have studied as well. At the back here, so the way we draw this, okay, so you have the ears and the nose there, so you know this is anterior, posterior, and these are the lateral parts. Okay, so this bone here at the back, this is your occipital bone. Okay, just gonna recap that a little bit. Okay, and at the sides here, okay, where we have the division between the medial and the posterior cranial fossa, so you can see the different cranial fossa here. So this here is your temporal bone. Okay, specifically that would be the petrous part of your temporal bone. All right, and then like a wing here, so you have a greater and lesser wing. This will be your sphenoid. Okay, this is your sphenoid bone with the sella turcica in the middle here. Okay, and then anteriorly, of course, will be your frontal bone. Okay, and then remember that you have the the cristae galeae there, and you have these bits in the midline there. So this is your ethmoid. Okay, with your cribriform plate of ethmoid there. For the movement of the olfactory bulbs. Okay, So you can see these are the bones of the base of the skull. That's your anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and your posterior cranial fossa with your with where the pituitary would sit in the cella thoracica here. Okay, so these bones here, right, they're going to be called chondrocranium. Why did they call chondrocranium? Remember how the neural crest cells and the paraxial mesoderm, okay, the somites that develop from the paraxial mesoderm will surround the cranial part of the neural tube. Okay, so in this area here, remember these bits here. Okay, so you can see you have the cells that are coming from the mesoderm and cells that are coming from the neural crest cells. So what's going to happen is that these cells, okay, so I'm just going to draw these cells here. You have the one coming from the mesoderm, okay, the paraxial mesoderm. So these are basically, they're known as your mesenchymal the neural crest cell, not so much, more so for this one, the multipotent, okay, multipotent mesenchymal cells. So these are, you know, they can differentiate into multiple things. Okay, so your multipotent mesenchymal cells, right, what they do is that they can differentiate. So they're going to differentiate into first they're going to differentiate to chondrocytes. Okay, so if you remember from your general anatomy, chondrocytes, they are going to make, they're going to make cartilage. Okay, so you're gonna make cartilage first, and then it will form a scaffolding of cartilage. And once you have that base layer, okay, the structure, the base structure, then only it will differentiate again. Okay, so it's going to differentiate again to become eventually the bone. Okay, and this is going to be your osteoblast. So in the beginning here, chondrocyte is going to be chondroblast first, and then it's going to mature, and it will become the osteoblast. So it will differentiate twice. All right. So not many bones in the body go through this kind of development. Okay, and this has a special name to it. So this is called your endochondral ossification. All right, and this is going to is what is happening for the chondrocranium, okay, the base of the skull here. So your multipotent mesenchymal cells, they will differentiate to become chondroblasts first. They will make the sort of like the cartilaginous model, and then only it will differentiate to become osteoblasts, and that would eventually become the bony part. Now, for the top part of the skull, so for the top part of the skull, as you know, you're going to have a few skulls, a few bones, okay, a few bones that will meet together. So you have your frontal bone, you have the parietal bone, you have two parietal bone, and then you have the occipital bone. So this is all going to be developed separately, and then they're going to have some areas, especially in infants, okay, in embryos, in fetus, as well as in infants. Okay, they're going to have the sutures that are not going to be ossified yet. Okay, so these sutures are all just cartilage first, right? And so in this region here is where you have all your fontanelle here between the coronal and the sagittal suture. What would be the bregma, and then what would be the lambda is between the sagittal and the lambdoid sutures. Right, so we know that in children, the skull, the bones of the skull cap has not yet fused together. Okay, and this area here, the membranous neurocranium, so again the same thing, they're going to get structures from here, okay, from the paraxial mesoderm that will go segmentation and form somites. So the occipital somites along with the neural crest cell is going to surround the top part as well. Okay, so the first was the base, the chondrocranium, and now we're going to look at the top part here, which is your membranous multipotent mesenchymal cells along with the what do you call that, neural crest. And same, they're going to differentiate, but this time they don't differentiate to become the chondroblasts first. Okay, they're going to straight away become the osteoblasts, right? And this here is how most of our bones are made. Okay, so they're going to go from the mesenchymal cell, multipotent mesenchymal cell, straight away to osteoblasts. They don't have any cartilaginous model to base the bony formation on. So this here is called the intramembranous ossification. Okay. Okay, I think there's some issues. Sorry, endochondral ossification is something that occurs very often. Okay, a lot of bones in our body. Okay, almost all bones in our body go through endochondral ossification. But intramembranous ossification, the one where it skips the chondroblast. Okay, this is the one that is quite rare. Not a lot of structures, not a lot of bones are made up this way. Not a lot of bones are made up straight from the mesenchymal cell to osteoblast. Okay, usually you have to go through the intermediary part, which is the chondroblast, but for the top part of the skull, the membranous neurocranium, it goes straight to become the osteoblast. So what are the bones that go through this intramembranous ossification? Remember, there's not many bones, so we can actually name them. Apart from the membranous neurocranium, you have the visceral cranium. Okay, so the bones of the face will also go through intramembranous ossification, which is something again quite rare. So membranous neurocranium, visceral cranium, and one more bone is the clavicles. Okay, so these are the only bones, the only group of bones that will go through intramembranous ossification. The rest of the bones in our body will go through endochondral ossification, where it needs to build the what do you call that, the cartilaginous model first with the chondroblast, and then only it will differentiate to osteoblasts. Okay, so as I mentioned, you have the bones, okay, that are separated, but sometimes you can have premature closure of all these sutures. Okay, instead of it being apart, the bones are all separate. Sometimes it can be fixed together, and it will be fixed together quite early on in life. Okay, so that would not be ideal. Okay, because our brains are constantly is still developing, especially from a fetus or infant to throughout childhood. The brain still needs to develop, still needs to become bigger, need to grow. But sometimes you have an issue where you have these sutures that are closed prematurely, and this is what is known as the clinical correlate. The name of this condition is craniosynostosis. Okay, craniosynostosis. Okay, so depending on what kind of suture or which suture is closed prematurely, you can have different names to it. Okay, so craniosynostosis is the big name for it, but depending on which suture, you can have specific names to it. Okay, so if, for instance, you have the early closure of the sagittal suture here, so you have your coronal suture is anteriorly, and then you have the lambdoid suture posteriorly. So connecting these two, you have the sagittal suture. So sagittal suture is in between the two parietal bones. All right, so if you can still remember, that's your frontal, parietal, occipital. Okay, so this is your coronal suture, that's your lambdoid suture, and in red here is what is supposed to be the sagittal suture. But sagittal suture has been closed prematurely. So instead of being able to grow this way, okay, so you're not able to grow this way because the sutures have already closed, you can only grow your skull this way. Okay, so anterior posteriorly, or they call it occipitofrontally. Okay, so you grow it anteroposterior wise, and this here is called scaphocephaly. Okay, scaphocephaly. cephally. Okay, what does it involve? What suture? What premature closure of which suture is your sagittal suture. Okay, so sagittal suture, and what happens because of the premature closure of the sagittal suture, you have expansion occurring in an occipito-frontal fashion. Okay, so you can only have that kind of expansion, and when that happens, what happens to the skull? Okay, so the skull will be long and narrow. So you can see in this picture here, the infant's skull, you can see it's quite long to the back because it can only grow that way. Okay. All right, another issue is when you can have a different kind of suture that will be closed prematurely. So in this picture here, you have the coronal suture now. So the sagittal suture is okay, the lambdoid is okay, the coronal suture has closed prematurely. So when the coronal suture closed prematurely, instead of it being able to grow this way, okay, like what we did here, now it's only going to be able to grow sideways. Okay, so this one cannot. So it can only grow sideways, and this issue here is called brachycephaly. Brachycephaly. So what is the suture that is involved is the coronal suture. Okay, so expansion will happen in a biparietal manner. Okay, or widthwise lah. Width. Okay, I hope that's how you spell widthwise. Width. Yeah, so that sounds right. Okay, and what will the skull look like? So the skull would look quite short. Okay, so as opposed to scaphocephaly where it's long and narrow, this is short and it's going to be broad. Okay, and some books they would describe it as being square-like. Okay, so you can see in this picture here, you can see this child's head. It's definitely not going to be this long, and it's shorter than what other children's head would be. Okay, and you can see it has this like the square-like pattern because it's going this way, but it can't grow this way. So we have this square-like structure to it. Okay, another more extreme kind of craniosynostosis is when you actually have premature closure of all your sutures. Okay, so the coronal suture is closed, the lambdoid suture is closed, the what do you call it, the sagittal suture is also closed, but sometimes what they have is this the anterior fontanelle is still somehow open. Okay, so when that happens, okay, the way that the brain can grow through is it can go through the anterior fontanelle, and you have this like three three external elevations. Okay, so you have something when you look at the side, you look from the front of the face, you have from the side, from the anterior fontanelle, and then from the side as well, and that is your face there. This is quite an extreme form of craniocystosis, and this is called clover leaf skull. Okay, because your clover leaf, it has this three leaf to it. Clover leaf are always a tree except for lucky ones where you have four. So yeah, that is an extreme form of craniosynostosis, and usually that occurs as part of like a syndrome. So it will be a collection of signs and symptoms that's associated, I think, mostly with genetic abnormalities. Okay, so we're done with the neurocranium. Now we're going to look at the viscerocranium before we take a break to do the trunk and the limbs. Okay, so viscerocranium is the bone structure of the skull. Okay, bone structure of the skull here. So the visceral cranium is going to develop through the pharyngeal arches. So I'm going to describe this more in detail in the next lecture, but I just would like to tell you that the visceral cranium, okay, you will use the first two pharyngeal arches mostly, so first, second, and that would form the bones of the face. Again, what is important, I think, for you to know in this juncture is that you have the paraxial, you have the mesoderm as well. So mesodermal cell for visceral cranium, mesodermal cell, if you remember, will go to become the chondroblast first, okay, and then that would differentiate to become the osteoblast. Okay, so visceral cranium will also go through what is known as intramembranous ossification. Okay, so intramembranous ossification, not many bones. We've actually talked about 66% of the bones that go through intramembranous ossification, which is the skull cap. Okay, so the membranous neurocranium and the visceral cranium. So along with that, we only have the clavicles that will also go through this intramembranous ossification. The rest will go through the endochondral ossification. Right, so these structures, we will talk, the development of these structures we'll talk later during pharyngeal arches. Okay.